Hey guys, tonight we wander back into the warm mud and moonlit reed beds of ancient Mesopotamia, where the first cities hum beside slow rivers and old stories murmur about the Anunnaki, those shadowy divine figures who in some later interpretations may have been remembered as mankind's forgotten creators. Some parts of tonight's journey are widely accepted history, some are interpretation, and some are calm, what-if imagination. Because when you step this far into the ancient world, the evidence suggests many things, while historians debate plenty more. You are walking into temples, tablets, and tales shaped by priests, kings, and a great deal of human curiosity. You also probably would not survive this very well, because even the glamorous ancient past still includes mud insects and the sort of daily labour that would make your modern spine file a formal complaint. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and feel free to post your location and local time as you listen tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in the deep south of Mesopotamia, in the land the Greeks will one day call Sumer, though the people living here are not thinking in neat textbook labels. They are thinking about grain water, mud brick, fish taxes offerings, and whether the canal wall is going to hold through another season. Most historians agree that this region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers gives rise to some of the earliest urban societies on Earth. What's broadly accepted is that by the 4th millennium BCE, places like Uruk are growing into true cities with monumental buildings, organised labour, and scribes beginning to scratch symbols into clay. That part is the solid ground. Then there is the mist, because once you move beyond the excavated walls, the storage jars, the temple platforms, and the endlessly patient shards of pottery, you find names, old names, divine names: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, and among the clusters of Mesopotamian gods, later texts speak of the Anunnaki, a group whose role shifts depending on time, place, and story. A careful reading might suggest they are not one fixed thing at all. Sometimes they seem like great gods of the heavenly order. Sometimes they appear closer to underworld judges. Sometimes they feel like a divine assembly, important, but not always consistent. Historians still argue whether the term points to a stable group across centuries, or whether it changes so much that modern readers are often chasing one word through many different meanings. Which honestly is a very ancient way to make modern people confused. You stand near a reed marsh at dusk and the air is heavy and damp. Frogs click in the shadows. The ground smells of wet clay and river silt. A city rises nearby, not in smooth marble splendour, but in sun-dried brick rough edges, smoke, woven mats, wooden doors and courtyards alive with work. Archaeology suggests that these early cities are not sudden miracles dropped from the sky. They grow through irrigation cooperation, conflict, religion, and relentless management of water. That may sound less magical than alien engineers descending in beams of light, but to be fair, organising thousands of humans without email is already suspiciously impressive. The people around you do not separate practical life from sacred life the way modern people often try to do. The temple is not merely a place of private belief. It is economic, political, agricultural, ceremonial. It stores goods, coordinates labour, and anchors the city's relationship with the cosmos. Most historians agree that religion in Sumer is woven into public life so tightly that asking where government ends and divinity begins is a little like asking where soup ends and broth begins. One interpretation is that stories of powerful divine beings emerge naturally in such a world because the forces ruling daily life really do feel larger than any one person. The river floods or fails, crops flourish or die, a ruler rises and falls, disease comes quietly, Storms arrive without apology. It is possible that the gods, including the beings later called Anunnaki, represent humanity's attempt to give shape to overwhelming systems, not just weather and death, but authority itself. And yet, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, there is also a reason these stories keep tugging at modern imagination. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not literal lab coats and glowing machines. No, let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it is not widely accepted. But what if ancient memory sometimes preserves emotional truth in symbolic form? What if the feeling of having been shaped, governed, instructed, or even owned by powers above oneself becomes a myth of creators in the sky? The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You move closer to the city gates as evening settles. Men carry baskets. Women grind grain. Children run past with the wild speed that all children seem to share across every century, usually when adults most need them not to. Somewhere a pot cracks. Somewhere a donkey voices its deeply unhelpful opinion about existence. Smoke drifts from cooking fires, and above it all, the first stars appear over the flat horizon. This is where the story of the Anunnaki has to begin, not in a spaceship hangar, disguised as a ziggurat, but here in ordinary human difficulty. The evidence we do have points to a civilization built by human hands, human planning, and human endurance. Irrigation canals do not dig themselves. Bricks do not stack themselves. Administrative tablets do not write themselves. A more cautious explanation could be that the grandeur of Sumer tempts later generations to imagine outside help, because human achievement on this scale feels almost unbelievable. And yet, unbelievable things happen all the time when enough people are organised, frightened, hopeful, and underfed. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. That matters tonight, because the title of our journey leans into one of the biggest mystery claims attached to the Anunnaki, the idea that they genetically created the human race. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has become one of the most popular modern rumours tied to Mesopotamia. A fringe idea proposes that ancient myths about gods shaping humans may preserve a garbled record of biological engineering by non-human beings. The problem is that the ancient texts themselves do not describe genetics in the modern scientific sense. What's broadly accepted is that creation in Mesopotamian myth often involves clay, divine intention, and sacred labour. The genetic creator's angle is a modern projection onto much older stories. Still, you can feel why it caught on. The image is vivid. Humanity formed with purpose. Humanity made to serve. Humanity carrying the mark of someone or something greater. It lands with a chill because it wraps modern anxieties in ancient mud. Are you free or designed? Are you accidental or assigned? Did you inherit your place, or were you built for it? Those are emotional questions long before they become speculative ones. The first city lights flicker small and amber, and the dark gathers around the reed beds. Somewhere in a temple precinct, a ritual begins. Somewhere a scribe presses marks into clay that will dry, harden, break, vanish, or survive for thousands of years by sheer unreasonable luck. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki began simply as part of that sacred world, divine figures within a religious system that changed over time. Another is that later readers, especially modern ones, turn them into ancient engineers because modern culture loves a puzzle with a dramatic villain or genius behind the curtain. But the earliest mood is quieter than that. You're not yet in the age of sensational claims. You're in the age of damp, earth-heavy baskets and stories told under starlight to explain why the world feels ordered one day and cruel the next. Most historians agree that the first civilizations did not need extraterrestrial tutoring to become complex. They needed Rivers' memory hierarchy and astonishing patience. Even so, a careful reading might suggest that the divine language wrapped around those early cities reveals a deeper human feeling, the sense that civilization itself arrived with such force and strangeness that it almost seemed given imposed or revealed from above. And that is where the Anunnaki first step into view. Not yet as certainty, not yet as forgotten creators with ancient DNA charts tucked under their celestial arms, but as part of a puzzle, a debated interpretation, a set of names moving through the earliest urban dreams of humankind. You stand in the half-dark, listening to frogs' temple songs and distant voices over the water, and the question begins to form. Not who built humanity with a machine, not yet, just who these old powers were meant to be and why their shadows still feel so long. The question stays with you as the night air settles over the city and the river slides past in the dark like a strip of black silk dragged through mud. You are still standing on the solid ground of ancient Mesopotamia, with your sandals already regretting every life decision that led them into wet clay. And now the names begin to gather around you more clearly. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Utu, Ninhursag. The world of Sumer is crowded with divine beings, but the title Anunnaki drifts through this crowd in a way that has fascinated modern readers far more than the ancient scribes probably intended. Archaeology suggests that the earliest written records in Mesopotamia do preserve divine names, temple accounts, hymns, myths, and ritual language that help you glimpse how these people imagined the cosmos. What's broadly accepted is that cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay, develops gradually from accounting systems into a powerful writing tradition capable of recording prayers, contracts, lists, epics, royal boasts, and deeply complicated theological ideas. Most historians agree that when you read Mesopotamian religion, you are not reading one neat holy book with fixed definitions. You are reading a vast patchwork spread over centuries, regions, and political changes. That matters because one interpretation is that the Anunnaki begin not as literal creators in a modern speculative sense, but as a shifting divine category, a family of gods perhaps, high-ranking deities perhaps, descendants of Anu perhaps. The trouble is that these possibilities do not always line up perfectly from one text to another. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were originally understood mainly as heavenly gods, ancestral gods, or a broader divine assembly whose role changed with time and place. In other words, they are exactly the kind of ancient subject that makes modern people lean in dramatically and say, aha, 5 minutes before discovering that the tablets have once again chosen ambiguity. You picture a scribe in a temple workshop seated with clay stylus, and the patient misery of someone doing paperwork for eternity. The tablet in front of him is small, damp and precious. Each wedge mark matters. He's not trying to feed your future documentary thumbnail. He's trying to record what his world believes, owes, fears, praises, or remembers. The evidence we do have points to gods being inseparable from civic life. Temples are dedicated to specific deities. Cities have divine patrons. Kings rule with divine sanction. Fields, canals, storms, childbirth, justice and war all sit under sacred oversight. So where do the Anunnaki fit in? A careful reading might suggest they are less like a single cast of unforgettable characters and more like an old title that shifts in meaning as traditions evolve. In some texts they seem associated with the highest levels of divine power. In others they are connected more strongly with the underworld. In later Mesopotamian material their role can feel darker, weightier, more judicial. Scholars continue to debate whether this reflects theological development, regional variation, or simply the ordinary untidiness of a religious tradition that lasted a very long time. And lasted it did. We are not talking about one little moment frozen in amber. Mesopotamian civilization stretches across millennia, Sumerian traditions interact with Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian ones. Languages shift, empires rise, gods merge, split, absorb qualities, change emphasis, or get promoted with all the serene chaos of ancient divine office politics. If a god's job description appears inconsistent, that is not necessarily evidence of hidden extraterrestrial editing. It may just be religion doing what religion often does, over long periods, growing, adapting, contradicting itself, and carrying old names into new meanings. Still, it is possible that the word Anunnaki preserved an aura of authority so strong that later readers sense something unusual in it. The sound itself carries weight. It feels old formal, a little severe. One interpretation is that modern fascination with the term comes partly from that mood. Say Anunnaki aloud, and it does not sound like a village weather spirit who blesses onions. It sounds like somebody who owns a seal ring and expects immediate obedience. You move through the temple quarter as dawn begins to pale the eastern sky. Workers are already stirring. Bread is baking. The smell of ash grain and damp brick mingles in the air. Somewhere nearby, a priest chants an offering formula to a god whose statue sits in a shrine, dressed, fed, washed, and honoured as though divinity were a kind of exalted kingship. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian gods were imagined in profoundly social terms. They had households, temples, possessions, preferences, rivalries, and powers. They were not abstract philosophical principles floating politely above life. They were active members of the cosmic state. That is one reason later Anunnaki theories gained traction. A fringe idea proposes that these gods seem strangely concrete because they were remembered from real contact with advanced beings. This theory is not widely accepted, but it thrives on the vividness of the ancient descriptions. Gods eat, gods speak, gods command labour, gods shape destinies, gods reside in specific places. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why some readers ask whether such language preserves more than symbolic meaning. But a more cautious explanation could be that ancient people describe the divine in familiar human terms, because human language works that way. You make sense of the vast through the household, the palace, the field, the storm, the judge's bench. The mystery is not in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. There is no full consensus on exactly how every term should be rendered, how every damaged tablet should be restored, or how every theological shift should be explained. But the mainstream view remains grounded. These are gods of ancient religion preserved through literary and ritual traditions, not documented biological engineers. You pause near a tablet archive. Imagine shelves or baskets holding clay texts in varying states of usefulness, some crisp and fresh, some chipped, some already on their way toward being tomorrow's archaeological headache. Archaeology suggests that much of what survives does so unevenly. Some tablets are complete, some are broken at the corners, some end in maddening silence right before the good part. Historians still argue whether certain references to divine groups in these texts should be read narrowly or broadly, because the context is often fragmentary. And fragments are irresistible. That is one of the quiet engines behind all mystery theory. When you have a broken line, your imagination rushes to help, often wearing far more jewellery than the evidence requested. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were always understood as a distinct class of creator beings who came from the heavens and later altered humanity. The evidence we do have points to something more layered and less cinematic. Their identity in the ancient sources is tied first to religion, myth, and divine hierarchy. The creator race image belongs much more to modern reinterpretation than to the oldest straightforward readings of the texts. That does not make the fascination foolish. It makes it revealing. Modern readers are often not just asking what the tablets say. They are asking why the tablets still feel alive. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe not hidden genetics, maybe not spacecraft, Maybe the older mystery is that the first civilizations created such enduring sacred language that you still feel it tugging on you 5,000 years later. Anu is sky, Enlil is command and storm, Enki is wisdom, watercraft, and cunning, Inanis is desire, power, and terrible beauty. Around them the idea of the Anunnaki gathers like a formal court, a divine nobility, a memory of order among powers above the human level. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here the evidence is strong enough to show the names, but not always strong enough to lock every name into one permanent role. So you keep walking with care. You listen to the stylus tapping clay. You hear the first market voices rise with the day. You watch smoke twist above temple roofs. And you begin to understand that the Anunnaki may have started not as forgotten scientists, but as something more ancient and more elusive, a changing divine idea written into the earliest literature of city life, waiting for later ages to turn them into whatever they most feared, desired, or hoped had once been watching. Or mean watching from above. By now, the names have settled around you like incense in a temple, room lingering even when the wind shifts, and as the morning brightens over the canals, you begin to notice something else moving beneath the stories. Not just who the gods are, but what they do with matter, what they do with clay, what they do with the strange problem of making people. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamian creation, traditions humanity is often linked to earth mud or clay. That broad image appears across the ancient Near East in different forms, and in Mesopotamia it carries a weight that feels both practical and symbolic. You do not need much imagination to see why. This is a civilization built out of mud brick in a river plain, where earth, water and labour shape nearly everything. Walls, houses, ovens, tablets, storage bins, temple terraces, all of it begins with the patient manipulation of wet ground. Archaeology suggests that if you live in Sumer long enough, clay stops being just material. It becomes destiny with fingerprints. So when the myths speak of human beings being formed from clay, the image lands with a natural power. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian literature includes accounts in which gods create humans for service order or relief from divine burdens. The exact details vary by text and tradition, but the theme is old and persistent. You are made from the same humble stuff as the city wall, only with the added inconvenience of opinions. One interpretation is that this tells you how deeply the Sumerians and their neighbours understood dependence. Humans are shaped things, made things, creatures of earth under authority. A careful reading might suggest the image is less about biology than about status. Clay is low, common, mouldable. To say humanity comes from clay is to say you begin in weakness, in obligation, in the wet grasp of forces larger than yourself. It is possible that the story reflects the experience of labouring populations whose lives are bound to temple field flood and king. And yet the image unsettles modern readers in a very specific way. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not proof, not certainty, not anything you could carry into a genetics lab without being escorted gently back outside, but something emotionally sharper. To shape clay is to design. To mix materials is to compose. To breathe or speak life into formed matter is to cross a line between object and being. This raises the possibility that later readers standing in a modern world, obsessed with code DNA and engineering, begin to hear old myths through new ears. That is how the genetic creators theory enters the room. A fringe idea proposes that descriptions of gods fashioning humanity may preserve a distant memory of biological intervention by advanced beings. This theory is not widely accepted, but it thrives because the old metaphors feel strangely adaptable. Clay becomes raw material. Divine essence becomes genetic input. sacred forming becomes a laboratory procedure. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see the mental bridge quite clearly. The modern imagination loves to translate ancient symbols into technological language, especially when the symbols involve making life. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That is a modern interpretive move, not something the ancient scribes themselves describe in scientific terms. The evidence we do have points to mythic ritual and literary language, not molecular biology. Historians still argue whether particular creation passages should be emphasized as theological metaphor, social explanation, or layered literary tradition. But mainstream scholarship does not treat them as hidden technical reports. You walk now beside a workyard where men knead mud with straw under the growing heat. Their feet sink and press. Their hands fold the mixture into shape. Nearby rows of bricks dry in the sun. The image is almost too perfect. The city itself is being made in front of you by the repeated shaping of earth. Most historians agree that ancient creation stories often borrow from ordinary craft, because craft is how humans understand power. A potter forms a vessel. A brickmaker forms a wall. A god forms a human. A more cautious explanation could be that the clay imagery reflects craft knowledge elevated into sacred meaning. That may sound less thrilling than forbidden genome edits under a Mesopotamian moon. But honestly, if you have ever tried to carry wet bricks in summer heat, you might agree that ordinary craft already borders on the supernatural. As the workers move, you notice the rhythm. Press lift, turn stack. Press lift, turn stack. Civilization is repetitive before it is glorious. That rhythm echoes in the myths too. Humanity is not made merely to exist. Humanity is made to work, to serve, to maintain order beneath the divine and royal world above. What's broadly accepted is that several Mesopotamian texts connect human creation with labour. One interpretation is that these myths express the reality of organised agricultural society, where huge populations sustain temple economies and political systems through constant toil. In that light, the clay story becomes almost painfully human. You are shaped from mud because your life is bound to mud. You are made by higher powers because your world is structured by higher powers. You are told you have purpose because labour feels easier to bear when dressed in cosmic language. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did ancient people mean this symbolically, socially, ritually, all at once? Very likely a bit of all three. Did they mean genetics? There is no evidence that they did in any modern sense. Still, there is a reason the theory refuses to go away. The image of being designed hits some old nerve in the human mind. You feel it as you watch a potter at his wheel nearby, shaping a vessel with wet hands, steady pressure and tiny corrections. The vessel rises because it is guided. A popular rumour claims that ancient myths about being made in the image or service of gods are garbled memories of literal manufacturing. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it takes a spiritual unease and gives it machinery. Were you formed with intention? Are your limits assigned? Is your restlessness inherited from the makers or from the mud? Those are ancient questions wearing modern clothes. Scholars continue to debate how closely different Mesopotamian creation stories relate to one another because Sumerian, Akkadian and Babylonian traditions overlap without becoming perfectly identical. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here, the documented part is simple enough. Human beings in these traditions are often made, shaped or fashioned from earthly material under divine initiative. The interpretive part is that this may mirror social realities of labour and hierarchy. The imaginative mist is everything later ages pour into that image, from mystical symbolism to cosmic engineering. You pass into a quieter lane where sunlight spills between mud brick walls and catches floating dust. A child plays with a little lump of clay near a doorway, pinching it into a rough animal, with the complete confidence of someone who has not yet learned that adults like to call messy genius untidy. The scene is small, almost laughably ordinary, and yet it contains the whole theme. To make is to imagine. To shape is to claim. To give form is to impose order on softness. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the deepest power of the clay motif is not that it hides a secret laboratory, but that it never lets you forget how fragile people are. Clay can harden, but it can also crack. It can bear weight, but it can also collapse in rain. To be made of clay is to be close to ruin from the beginning. Archaeology suggests that the same material that built Sumer also preserved it, because clay tablets, once baked by accident or purpose, could outlast wood, fabric and flesh. So the irony is almost poetic. The people imagine themselves as shaped from clay, and it is clay that carries their thoughts forward to you. You hold that image as the day warms, wet earth in the hands of makers, human life as design duty and dust. And somewhere behind the myths, behind the labour, behind the later speculation, the old question sharpens a little more. If the gods fashioned humanity from clay, were they describing creation dependence, or simply the ache of being something formed for work beneath a very large sky? The question lingers as the sun climbs higher and the city begins to sound less like a mystery and more like a workplace with divine branding. Everywhere you turn, someone is hauling, kneading, measuring, listing, counting, carrying, sweeping, repairing, or trying very hard not to be noticed by whoever is in charge. And that in its own quiet way brings you closer to one of the most important themes in Mesopotamian creation stories. Not just that humans are made, but that humans are made for something. More specifically, made to work. What's broadly accepted is that in several Mesopotamian traditions, the creation of humanity is linked to labour. The gods exist in a structured cosmos, and in some myths, the human race comes into being so that the burdens of work, maintenance and ritual service can be transferred downward. Most historians agree that this reflects something real about ancient society. These are worlds built on organised effort. Canals must be cleared, fields must be planted, grain must be stored, temples must be supplied, offerings must be made on time, because apparently even the divine realm appreciates a functioning schedule. One interpretation is that these stories do not simply explain where people came from. They explain why life feels like a shift that started before sunrise and somehow still is not over. You walk along the edge of a canal where crews are scraping mud and silt with wooden tools piling the wet weight into baskets their shoulders already slick with heat. The work is repetitive, physical and absolutely necessary. Archaeology suggests that irrigation is one of the foundations of southern Mesopotamian civilization. Without canals, levees and carefully managed water, agriculture here becomes unreliable very quickly. What's broadly accepted is that the first cities are not born out of leisure. They are built through constant coordination and seasonal struggle. So when a myth says the gods created human beings to take over labour, it lands with an almost painful clarity. A careful reading might suggest that such myths are not cosmic fantasies floating above daily life. They are daily life translated upward into divine language. The tired worker looking at the canal may not describe his exhaustion in abstract economic theory. He may describe it through story. The gods needed help. The burden had to go somewhere. Humanity arrived as the answer. That is not exactly a cheerful welcome speech. Still, it makes a certain ancient sense. In later Mesopotamian traditions, especially in the Atrahasis story and related material, divine beings are described as taking on work before humanity is created, and eventually humans are fashioned to relieve them. Historians still argue whether these narratives should be read mainly as social allegory, theological reflection, or literary exploration of order and obligation. But the theme of labour is difficult to miss. The evidence we do have points to a civilization deeply aware that someone always is carrying the load. That has encouraged a very modern leap. A fringe idea proposes that if ancient texts describe humans as workers made by higher beings, perhaps they preserve a literal account of manufactured humanity, even something like a designed labour force. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is easy to see why it spread. The wording feels uncannily suited to the modern ear. Created to serve, built for a task, shaped by superior intelligences. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the mythology can sound less like religion and more like cosmic outsourcing, which is an extremely dramatic way to describe getting stuck with chores forever. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that these myths emerge from the social realities of early states where labour is organised hierarchically and where the distance between ruler and worker can feel almost divine in scale. Kings command, priests direct, officials record, workers sweat. The structure of the city mirrors the structure of the cosmos, because that is how societies often justify themselves. The higher powers above are served by the lower powers below. In this reading, humans are not genetically engineered miners for visiting beings. They are theological reflections of real agricultural populations whose lives revolve around service and duty. You step into the shade of a temple courtyard and feel the sudden relief of cooler air against your skin. A priest passes carrying a vessel. Nearby a scribe reads from a tablet, while another worker brings in sacks of grain. The temple is not just a spiritual centre, it is an economic machine. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian temples managed land labour, storage and offerings alongside ritual. In that sense, sacred service and practical service blend together. To feed the temple is to feed the god. To maintain the canal is to maintain the cosmic order. To work is not merely survival, it is participation in a system that claims divine meaning. One interpretation is that this is why the workers of the gods idea becomes so durable. It explains toil without pretending toil is random. You are tired because the structure of the world requires effort. You belong to something larger. Your sweat means something. Whether that is comforting or slightly manipulative may depend on whether you are the king or the man with the shovel. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did ordinary labourers hear these myths and feel dignified, resigned, resentful, or all three? The texts do not often pause to interview the canal crew, which is rude but unsurprising. Archaeology suggests hierarchy, ration systems, and institutional control, but inner feelings are harder to recover. What's broadly accepted is the structure. The emotional temperature remains partly in shadow, and that shadow is where later Anunnaki theories love to settle. A popular rumour claims that the old stories preserve memory of humanity being engineered as a servant species by non-human creators, sometimes specifically identified with the Anunnaki in modern retellings. This theory is not widely accepted, and the ancient evidence for it is thin. The ancient texts do speak of gods making humans for labour, but they do so in mythic and theological language, not in the vocabulary of laboratories, genomes, or machines. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here it is thin indeed when it comes to literal biological engineering. Still, the emotional force is undeniable. You can feel it in the city around you. The woman grinding grain before dawn, the men lifting baskets from the canal, the child carrying water almost too heavy for small arms, the official checking measures with the calm menace of someone who has invented bureaucracy just to ruin your afternoon. In such a world, the notion that people were made to serve does not feel abstract. It feels like the weather. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian myths often connect human origins to labour and divine need. The interpretive part is that these myths may mirror the realities of temple economies and stratified city life. The imaginative missed is the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was remembered from some older intervention by powerful beings whose motives were practical rather than loving. What if the story is pointing at something else? Perhaps the oldest shock inside these myths is not that the gods made people, but that they made people with a job description. That idea cuts across time in an almost uncomfortable way. Modern life likes to flatter you with words like fulfillment and self-actualization. But ancient myth occasionally looks at the whole arrangement and says very calmly, yes, but who is emptying the canals? You move again through the city, past storehouses, workshops, ovens and narrow lanes, where life is all motion and management. A donkey brays as though personally offended by organised civilization. Someone shouts over missing barley. A woman laughs at something you do not hear. A boy chases a chicken with the concentration of a future general and the strategy of a future disaster. It is all very human, and that may be the key point. Most historians agree that the rise of cities does not require supernatural engineers. It requires institutions, memory coercion skill, and generations of labour so repetitive it becomes invisible. One interpretation is that creation myths preserve that truth in sacred form. Humanity comes into being already embedded in obligation. You are not first a free wanderer and then a worker. In these stories, you arrive already enrolled. And as the heat thickens over the water and the temple banners barely stir, the old Anunnaki question shifts again. Not who built you in some lost machine shop, but why so many ancient stories imagine being human as a form of service in the first place. That too is a clue. Perhaps not to hidden genetics, but to something more enduring, the uneasy human suspicion that existence itself may come with duties assigned from above. That uneasy suspicion follows you into the archives, into the storerooms, into the temples, and finally into the broken edges of the tablets themselves. By now you have walked through wet clay divine names, creation imagery, and the heavy logic of labour, and it would be very satisfying if the ancient record now opened like a well-organised cabinet and handed you a neat answer labelled Anunnaki, definitive meaning, please enjoy. Instead, what you get is damage, chips, cracks, missing lines, scribal variation, centuries of retelling. The ancient world, like every office that has ever lost an important file, was not built for your convenience. Archaeology suggests that much of what survives from Mesopotamia survives unevenly. Clay tablets are durable compared with parchment or wood, but they are not magical. They break. They erode. They are reused. They are buried in collapse layers, scorched in destruction, or preserved by pure accident. Most historians agree that our knowledge of Mesopotamian myth comes from patchwork of finds recovered across different sites, periods and languages. Some texts are nearly complete. Others stop just when they are about to explain the thing you desperately want explained, which is a very old form of emotional sabotage. And this matters more than it first appears, because one interpretation is that the gaps themselves have encouraged bold theories about the Anunnaki. When a line is broken, imagination rushes in like a cat through an open door. The evidence we do have points to a complex religious world with shifting terminology, layered traditions, and local variation. But the missing pieces create a mood, and mystery theories feed on mood almost as eagerly as they feed on evidence. You sit now in your mind beside a scribe's work table. The clay is fresh. The stylus leaves its wedge marks in neat practice rhythms. A text is being copied from an older exemplar, maybe faithfully, maybe with a few changes, maybe with a slight misunderstanding, maybe with a phrase modern scholars will one day spend decades arguing over in very serious tones. Historians still argue whether some difficult terms in Mesopotamian texts should be translated one way or another, because the grammar, context and damage do not always cooperate. That uncertainty is not a flaw in scholarship. It is the honest shape of the surviving evidence. What's broadly accepted is that cuneiform scholarship requires patience, comparison and caution. You do not usually get one tablet that says, in plain modern prose, "Hello future reader, here is the exact doctrine, and also sorry about the broken corner." Instead, you compare copies, restore parallels, examine formulas, and weigh probabilities. A careful reading might suggest that the Anunnaki as a category resist modern simplification, partly because ancient scribes were not trying to write a tidy handbook for people who enjoy late-night theories on glowing screens. So when later readers insist they have cracked the whole code from a handful of famous passages, you should probably take a slow breath. A fringe idea proposes that the damaged state of many tablets hides suppressed truths about the Anunnaki, as though the missing lines once contained explicit references to advanced creators, forbidden knowledge, or human engineering. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives in the spaces where evidence is incomplete. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see the psychological appeal. A broken text invites rescue. A fragment invites completion. The human brain does not enjoy uncertainty. It wants the scattered pieces to form a picture, preferably one dramatic enough to justify staying awake for it. But a more cautious explanation could be that damaged texts are simply damaged texts. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Missing lines do not automatically conceal sensational ideas. Often they conceal something much less cinematic, like a prayer formula, a title, or the ancient equivalent of administrative throat clearing. Scholars continue to debate restorations precisely because responsible interpretation requires admitting what is lost. You walk through a quiet room lined with tablets, each one a small rectangle of hardened earth, carrying marks that once mattered urgently to someone. Grain accounts, legal agreements, hymns, lexical lists, myths, incantations, royal inscriptions. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian writing emerges first for practical administration and later expands into literature and scholarly tradition. This means the same material world that preserves divine stories also preserves the bookkeeping of barley and sheep, which, if nothing else, is a beautiful reminder that civilization runs on both myth and paperwork often wins more arguments than myth would like. The Anunnaki appear within that larger written world not in a vacuum. One interpretation is that because so many texts are context-specific, ritual, literary, or political, the meaning of divine groups changes according to purpose. A hymn is not a god list, a myth is not a royal inscription, a funerary context is not a temple dedication. Historians still argue whether modern readers too often flatten these genres together when reconstructing the Anunnaki pulling lines from different centuries, and functions as if they were one continuous manifesto. That flattening is where trouble begins, because once you ignore genre date and damage everything, starts to look like a clue in the same grand conspiracy board. An underworld reference becomes extraterrestrial judgment. A divine assembly becomes a council of visiting engineers. A broken phrase becomes missing science. A poetic line becomes literal memory. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That is a possibility, not a certainty, and in mainstream scholarship, it is usually not the preferred reading. What's broadly accepted is that ancient myth uses symbolic, ritual, and narrative language in ways that do not map neatly onto modern technical categories. Still, the fragments do have power. You feel it as you imagine a tablet with one corner gone, the sentence trailing into silence. It's possible that this is one reason Mesopotamian stories remain so magnetically alive. They are not fully closed systems. They are wounded texts. They survived warfire collapse, looting weather, and long burial. They come to you incomplete, and incomplete things often feel more haunted than finished ones. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the broken lines matter not because they hide a secret answer, but because they expose the limits of certainty itself. Ancient history, especially at this depth, is rarely a spotlight. It is moonlight on rubble. You see edges, outlines, sudden details, and then darkness again. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here the evidence is sometimes frustratingly thin, and that frustration is part of the story. You hear voices outside the archive, low and practical. A crate is moved. Someone coughs. Dust hangs in a strip of sunlight like pale smoke. The whole room smells faintly of earth baked long ago. A popular rumour claims that scholars already know the Anunnaki were literal creators and simply refuse to say so. The evidence we do have points the other way. Mainstream historians and Assyriologists are often intensely careful because the material is difficult, damaged, and context dependent. Their caution is not proof of suppression. It is usually proof that they have met enough broken tablets to respect uncertainty. An uncertainty, though, less glamorous than revelation, is the honest companion of this journey. So you continue with the fragments in hand. You do not throw them away, and you do not force them to say more than they can. You let the cracks remain visible. You let the silences remain silent. The Anunnaki are still there, moving through the record like half-seen figures through temple smoke, important enough to matter, elusive enough to resist being pinned down. Perhaps that is why they keep returning in modern imagination. Not because the tablets speak with perfect clarity, but because they do not. The gaps invite you closer. The broken edges make room for wonder, error theory, and the oldest temptation of all the hope that somewhere in the missing lines there waits an answer grand enough to explain why human beings have always felt both fashioned and unfinished. The broken tablets stay with you as you move back out into the sun, because once you have learned how incomplete the record can be, every grand ancient claim begins to sound a little softer around the edges, and yet some texts seem almost designed to tempt exaggeration. Few do this more effectively than the famous lists of kings and the old flood traditions where history, memory, theology and spectacle all sit down together and decide to become wonderfully inconvenient. Most historians agree that the Sumerian king list is one of the most intriguing texts from ancient Mesopotamia. What's broadly accepted is that it presents a sequence of rulers and dynasties combining figures who may reflect historical memory with reign lengths that often become impossibly vast, especially in the earliest sections. Before the Great Flood, kings are said to rule for spans that stretch into tens of thousands of years. After the flood, the numbers begin gradually to shrink, though they can still remain impressively unrealistic for a while, as though time itself had not fully accepted the concept of moderation. You picture a scribe reciting these names in a room heavy with dust and ritual seriousness, the list reaching back toward the beginnings that already feel mythic, even to the people preserving them. Archaeology suggests that later portions of the king list overlap more clearly with known cities and plausible historical sequences, while the earliest sections sit in a much murkier zone between memory and myth. One interpretation is that the fantastically long reigns are literary tools used to magnify the authority of the earliest age. A careful reading might suggest they signal sacred distance rather than literal chronology. Historians still argue whether the king list should be treated mainly as political propaganda, dynastic ideology, historical memory wrapped in theology, or some careful blend of all three. That blend matters, because once modern readers encounter those impossible numbers, the mystery machinery starts humming immediately. A fringe idea proposes that the immense lifespans and reign lengths preserve memory of non-human rulers, advanced beings, or godlike overseers, sometimes folded into modern Anunnaki theories. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it catches the imagination with ease. If ancient kings ruled for 30,000 years, perhaps they were not ordinary humans. If the flood divided time itself, perhaps the world before it was genuinely different. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the text begins to feel less like royal ideology and more like a coded remnant from a lost age. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient Near Eastern traditions often use grand numbers symbolically. Vast reigns create prestige. They stretch the past into sacred space. They tell you that the first age was heavier, deeper, closer to divine order than your own diminished present. Most historians agree that exaggerated numbers in ancient texts do not automatically function as literal records. Sometimes they are trying to communicate status, antiquity, legitimacy, or cosmic significance, rather than calendar math. Still, when you stand in an early Mesopotamian city and hear about antediluvian kings who ruled for ages beyond belief, the atmosphere changes. The ordinary world of canal mud and grain rations suddenly opens into deep time. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not hidden proof of alien monarchs, perhaps, but an ancient intuition that the beginning of civilization felt qualitatively different from what followed. More luminous, more ordered, more frightening, more touched by powers above. You walk now toward the edge of a ceremonial precinct where a storyteller speaks to a small gathered group, and in his voice the flood arrives. Waters rise, cities vanish, the world is reordered. Most historians agree that flood traditions are widespread in Mesopotamia, appearing in texts with different emphases and versions over time. The evidence we do have points to the importance of river flooding in the region, though specific mythic flood stories are not simple reports of one neatly datable event. One interpretation is that the flood functions as both memory and symbol, reflecting real environmental danger while also marking a moral or cosmic reset. That combination of realism and myth is exactly why flood stories become so powerful. They sit with one foot on solid ground and the other in dream. A popular rumour claims that the flood marks the end of an age when the Anunnaki or beings later associated with them ruled directly over humanity or manipulated human development. This theory is not widely accepted, and the ancient evidence for such a scenario is thin. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian flood narratives speak more directly about divine decision, human survival, and the fragile relationship between order and destruction. But if the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and here the thinness itself has made room for endless speculation. You can feel the appeal. Before the flood, kings reign impossibly long. After it, the scale contracts. Before the flood, the world seems half divine. After it, the human condition tightens. A careful reading might suggest that this is not about biology at all, but about the ancient sense of decline. Many civilizations imagine that the earliest age was greater than the present one. The first kings stand taller. The first cities are holier. The first order is closer to the gods. The long reigns may simply embody that distance in numerical form. And yet numbers have moods. 36,000 years does not feel like administration. It feels like a torch being waved in a dark room. Scholars continue to debate how much genuine historical memory can be extracted from texts like the Sumerian king list, particularly in its earliest portions. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the text exists, that it preserves dynastic sequences, and that some later rulers correspond more plausibly to known historical settings. The interpretive part is that the early fabulous reigns may express sacred kingship or political ideology. The imaginative mist is the thought that maybe those colossal numbers echo something half-remembered about a time when humanity believed its rulers were closer to the divine than to the human. You pass a shrine wall where old mud brick has been patched again and again, each layer preserving a repair from a different generation. That is the feeling of Mesopotamian memory itself. Not one clean structure, but repairs over repairs, names over names, old claims reinforced by new ones. Archaeology suggests that kingship in Mesopotamia is not merely administrative, it is cosmological. Rule descends from heaven. Cities receive divine favour. Thrones are not just occupied, they are legitimated. That may help explain why the earliest kings in the list are stretched to impossible grandeur. They are not just predecessors, they are almost threshold beings. Which is where modern Anunnaki readings begin to feed again. If the first rulers seem almost beyond human scale, some later readers wonder whether they belong to the same category as the great gods or their offspring. A fringe idea proposes that the long-lived kings were hybrids, engineered elites or descendants of creator beings. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows its energy from the old Mesopotamian habit of placing kingship between heaven and earth. A more cautious explanation could be that royal ideology everywhere tends to magnify rulers until they no longer resemble the people carrying their bricks. Honestly, that part of history may be the least mysterious thing about it. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You cannot recover the exact mental world of the first people who heard these names and numbers. Did they believe them literally, symbolically, ceremonially, selectively? Historians still argue whether ancient audiences approached such texts the way later literalists sometimes do. The tablets do not answer with modern neatness. So you walk on through a world where floodwaters divide the ages and kings stand at impossible heights. The old question of the Anunnaki shifts again. Perhaps the clue is not that ancient texts hide a scientific account of human creation, but that they preserve a deep memory of hierarchy so extreme it becomes mythic. Before the flood rule feels vast and distant, almost not human at all. After the flood, history narrows, but the shadow remains. Long-lived kings, world-resetting waters, authority descending from heaven. You do not yet have a hidden laboratory. What you do have is a civilization repeatedly imagining its beginnings as larger than ordinary life, and that alone is enough to keep the mystery breathing. The shadow of those impossible kings stays with you as the day leans toward evening again, because once a civilization begins saying that rule descends from heaven, you can no longer treat its gods as decorative background figures. They are not ornaments perched on top of politics. They are inside the architecture of power itself. And now as the light softens over the river plain, you begin to see the Anunnaki less as isolated names, and more as part of a heavenly household, a layered divine order whose structure may have shaped everything below it. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion imagines the cosmos as ordered, populated, and governed. Anu is commonly associated with the heavens, Enlil, with authority, air and command, Enki, with wisdom, water and craft, and other major deities occupy their own powerful spheres. Archaeology suggests that temples' hymns, offering lists and mythic texts, all reflect a world in which the divine realm functions almost like an exalted court. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian people did not imagine the universe as spiritually empty. They imagined it as administered. That alone explains a great deal. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki belong within this administrative cosmos as a high-ranking collective, a kind of divine nobility surrounding or descending from the great gods. A careful reading might suggest that their importance lies less in one fixed task and more in their place within sacred hierarchy. They are part of the structure through which divine authority is imagined. Historians still argue whether the Anunnaki were consistently understood as heavenly powers, ancestral deities, underworld judges, or some combination that evolved over time. The evidence we do have points to variation, not perfect uniformity. And variation in ancient religion is usually normal rather than suspicious. You walk into a temple court as evening offerings are prepared, lamps are being lit, incense begins to rise. The whole space feels formal without being silent. There is movement everywhere, but it is ordered movement. Bowls placed in sequence, cloth adjusted with care, grain measured, oil poured. Nothing is casual. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian temples were structured around regular ritual service, and ritual itself reinforced the sense that the cosmos was not random. Gods received what was due. Cities maintained their sacred relationships. The hierarchy held. In such a world, the idea of a divine household makes intuitive sense. A king has officials, servants, messengers, and kin. A god, especially a great god, would too. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki may have represented, at least in some contexts, the old and weighty prestige of that larger sacred assembly. Not always the chief deity, not always the direct creator in every text, but part of the council-like structure that made divine order feel socially real. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the Anunnaki may have mattered because they gave the heavens a courtly shape people could understand. That is one path. Another much more modern path takes the same hierarchy and reads it through the lens of outsider theories. A fringe idea proposes that this divine household was remembered from actual contact with powerful beings, perhaps visitors, rulers, or advanced entities, later mythologized as gods. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it gains traction because the old language of rank command and descent from heaven sounds uncannily concrete. A popular rumour claims that the Anunnaki were not symbolic at all, but literal elites who governed the early world, and may even have directed human development. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the ancient evidence for it is far thinner than the modern storytelling around it. A more cautious explanation could be that humans naturally project political structure onto the cosmos. If your world is ruled by households, courts, and administrative chains, your gods will often look like perfected versions of the same. The heavenly court may reflect earthly governance, just as much as earthly governance seeks legitimacy from heaven. You move toward a shrine where a divine statue stands in dim light, beautifully dressed, still and overwhelming. To a modern eye, it might look like an idol. To the people around you, it is more like a point of presence, a focal place where divine relationship becomes concrete. Most historians agree that the care of cult statues in Mesopotamia was part of a living ritual system. Gods were fed, clothed, honoured, and approached with formality. This is not because the divine was thought weak, but because relationship required maintenance. And that tells you something important about hierarchy. The gods are not distant abstractions. They are rulers with local addresses. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the enduring power of the Anunnaki comes from this strange blend of distance and administration. They are cosmic yet social, vast yet structured, beyond you yet somehow arranged, like a palace staff whose job descriptions have been half lost in the archives. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Were the Anunnaki originally imagined as a specific clan of gods, tied tightly to Anu, did they become broader over time? Did different cities mean different things by the same word? Scholars continue to debate these questions because the textual record does not always let one answer rule unchallenged. You sit for a moment near a wall cooled by evening shadow. The smell of oiled lamps and dust hangs around you. Somewhere nearby, a priest clears his throat with the solemn drama of a man about to say something important, or at least sound as though he is. Children whisper in a side courtyard until someone hushes them. It is also orderly, and yet beneath the order there is always that old Mesopotamian uncertainty. Floods happen, walls crack, kings die, crops fail. So perhaps the divine hierarchy matters because it promises that above the instability there remains a court that does not sleep. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian religion was richly hierarchical, and that divine groups, such as the Anunnaki, appear in that setting. The interpretive part is that they may have functioned as a prestigious collective within the broader sacred order, rather than as one simple creator team. The imaginative mist is the idea that such a hierarchy preserves dim memory of non-human rulers whose authority once felt immediate enough to be remembered for millennia. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here it is thin when it comes to literal contact. The texts themselves do not give you a straightforward record of celestial governors arriving with technical manuals and a firm plan for workforce management. What's broadly accepted is more human, and perhaps in its own way more revealing. The first cities needed order badly enough that they imagined the heavens themselves as organised. A heavenly household made the universe feel governable. And once you picture the cosmos that way, humanity's place becomes clearer too. You are not drifting free beneath the stars. You are living under ranks, powers, duties, decrees, and invisible administrations. That may be why later creator theories attach so easily to the Anunnaki. If the heavens are a court, then perhaps humanity is not merely born. Perhaps humanity is assigned. Perhaps the old stories feel so sharp because they tell you what many people in every age half suspect anyway, that existence comes already nested inside structures you did not choose. You rise and continue through the lamplit city. Above the temple roof, the first stars appear again. The same sky that gave Anu his domain now stretches cool and silent over the plain. Somewhere in the sacred imagination of Mesopotamia, the heavens are not empty. They are inhabited, ranked and listening. The Anunnaki move there as part of that old order, neither simple nor fixed, but important enough to cast a long after image. And as darkness gathers once more over the canals, the question deepens. If divine hierarchy shaped the human picture of the universe so completely, could that also be where the later story of creator beings truly begins, not in hidden machines, but in the ancient conviction that the world above must somehow govern the life below? That conviction follows you into the night, and by now, the city no longer feels like a simple cluster of houses beside water. It feels like a diagram of the universe made out of mud brick smoke and repetition. The temple rises above the streets. The streets feed the storehouses. The storehouses feed the workers. The workers maintain the canals. The canals sustain the fields. The fields feed the temple again. It is all connected, all measured, all watched, and when you lift your eyes from this very earthly circuitry to the sky above Mesopotamia, you begin to understand why later generations were so tempted to imagine the ancient priests as guardians of some astonishing hidden knowledge. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian scholars and priests paid close attention to celestial patterns. Archaeology suggests that across the long history of Mesopotamia, especially more clearly in later Babylonian periods, learned specialists observed the movements of stars, planets, and the moon with remarkable care. Calendars, ritual timing, omens, and agricultural rhythms all depended on watching the heavens. Most historians agree that this was not astronomy in the modern laboratory sense, but it was disciplined sky knowledge built through repetition, record keeping, and generations of careful observation. And when you stand beneath the desert dark sky with no city glow to dull it, careful observation starts to feel almost supernatural. The stars are sharp enough to make you squint. The moon throws pale light across the reed beds. Constellations rise with that slow, indifferent grace only the heavens can manage, as though they have never once worried about taxes, damp sandals, or the possibility of your barley ration being miscounted by a sleepy official. In this setting, one interpretation is that sacred astronomy became one of the ways Mesopotamian civilization stitched heaven and earth together. A careful reading might suggest that by tracking the skies, priests were not merely gathering data, they were maintaining cosmic relationship. Historians still argue whether we should sharply separate religion and science in the ancient Mesopotamian context, because for the people living here, those categories were deeply intertwined. That matters for the Anunnaki question because a popular modern leap happens right here. A fringe idea proposes that ancient star knowledge was so advanced, so precise, or so symbolically rich that it must have come from outside ordinary human development, perhaps from the same creator beings later associated with the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has staying power because old astronomy feels mysterious to modern audiences. If priests could predict cycles align, rituals, and preserve celestial patterns across centuries, maybe some say they were preserving instructions passed down from superior beings. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the evidence we do have points to human diligence rather than extraterrestrial tutoring. What's broadly accepted is that skywatching becomes more sophisticated over time through sustained observation. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient peoples became excellent at reading the heavens because their lives depended on seasonal timing, ritual order, and the need to make sense of unpredictable worlds. You do not need alien mathematics to notice that the moon keeps showing up and ruining your sleep schedule on a regular basis. You climb a temple stair in the cool hours before dawn and pause beside a priestly observer. He says little. He has a tablet, perhaps a stylus, perhaps simply memory sharpened by training. He watches the horizon with the patience of someone who understands that the sky does not care whether you are bored. Below the city sleeps in patches. A dog barks once. A baby cries somewhere in the dark. A reed mat flaps lightly in a courtyard. Above the stars continue their great silent bureaucracy. One interpretation is that the prestige of temple scholars grew partly because they could translate celestial movement into earthly meaning. If the heavens signalled divine intention, then those who read the heavens stood close to power. Most historians agree that omens and celestial signs played an important role in Mesopotamian thought. Eclipses, unusual planetary appearances, and other phenomena could be read as messages about kingship, danger, blessing, or upheaval. The sky was not merely beautiful, it was political. And once the sky becomes political, the heavens begin to feel inhabited in a much more active way. That may help explain why the Anunnaki, as part of a divine order connected to heaven, later attracted so much speculative energy. What if the story is pointing at something else? Not literal spacecraft mapped in cuneiform star lists, perhaps, but an ancient recognition that the sky governs human life in ways both obvious and profound. The moon regulates time. The stars orient travel and ritual. The sun orders labour. The heavens are distant yet deeply practical. They rule without touching. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Did some priestly traditions carry more sophisticated astronomical understanding than we can now easily reconstruct? Very likely, in some cases, yes. Did that knowledge feel sacred because it linked predictable patterns with divine order? Also yes. Did it come from creator beings descending with celestial manuals and a very firm preference for administrative tidiness? The ancient evidence does not require that conclusion. Still, the atmosphere invites it. You can feel why modern readers look at the stars over ancient Mesopotamia and begin whispering about lost science. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian religious specialists tracked the heavens with seriousness and skill. The interpretive part is that such observation reinforced the idea of a governed cosmos in which divine hierarchy mattered. The imaginative mist is the thought that perhaps hidden inside this sacred astronomy there survives a memory of beings whose knowledge once exceeded the human horizon. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here the evidence for literal advanced contact is thin indeed, but the evidence for awe is very strong. And awe can do a great deal of narrative work. You remain on the stair as dawn begins to gather faintly in the east. The stars lose their sharpness one by one. The city below stirs. Smoke begins to rise from cooking fires. Somewhere behind you, sandals scrape on stone, as another temple servant arrives already tired in advance, which is one of the great enduring talents of organised civilization. The priest beside you marks something down or commits it to memory. Another day is aligning itself with the sky. Most historians agree that ancient temple systems relied on repeated acts of order, rituals at the right time, offerings in the right measure, calendars kept correctly. The heavens provided a model of pattern, and human society tried with mixed success to imitate it. One interpretation is that this is why divine creator stories and sacred astronomy sit so comfortably together. If the gods made the world, then the sky reveals their schedule. If divine beings established human life, then celestial regularity becomes part of the same design. A popular rumour claims that the ancients encoded technical knowledge in myths because they were preserving forbidden truths about mankind's makers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it borrows its emotional force from something very old and very real, the sense that order itself feels taught. When the stars move with such consistency and the seasons return with such precision, it's easy to imagine a mind behind them. But a more cautious explanation could be that human beings are pattern-hungry creatures living under a patterned sky. You descend from the temple as daylight spreads across the river plain. The canal gleams, the workers reappear. The city resumes its endless choreography. Above it all, the heavens look deceptively calm, as though nothing mysterious has happened there at all, and perhaps that is the real trick. The old Mesopotamian world did not need hidden technology to make the sky feel alive. It needed only attention, the same attention that made priests into timekeepers, stars into omens, and divine hierarchy into a believable frame for existence. The Anunnaki remain somewhere in that frame, shadowy figures of heaven and order, while below them humanity continues kneading clay, lifting baskets, and searching the stars for signs that someone somewhere above might actually know what all this was for. By the time the sun is up again and the city begins its daily argument with dust, heat, and basic survival, you have climbed through quite a lot of sacred architecture, clay origins, divine households, impossible kings, flood memories, star-watching priests, and now at last the modern word slips in through the ancient door like a guest dressed for entirely the wrong century genes. This is where the Anunnaki story takes one of its sharpest modern turns. Most historians agree that genetic science belongs to the modern world. DNA heredity, in molecular terms, chromosomes, laboratory manipulation, all of that is separated from ancient Mesopotamia, not just by time, but by an entirely different framework of knowledge. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian creation stories speak in mythic ritual and symbolic language. They describe shaping, mixing, divine intention, blood clay, breath, service, and cosmic order. They do not describe genomes. Archaeology suggests texts from this world are concerned with meaning, hierarchy, and function more than with biological mechanism. And yet one interpretation is that modern readers standing inside a scientific age cannot help hearing old creation stories through the vocabulary of design. When an ancient text says humans are made from clay and divine substance, or that people are fashioned for a purpose, a careful reading might suggest theological symbolism. But a different, much more modern imagination hears procedure, input, material, modification, prototype, product. Suddenly, the old myths sound less like liturgy and more like a laboratory report that lost all its technical nouns. That is the bridge the genetic creators theory tries to cross. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki, usually in modern retellings, rather than ancient texts themselves, engineered humanity by combining their own biological material with that of an earlier creature. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it has spread widely because it feels tailor-made for contemporary anxieties and fascinations. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see the appeal at once. Ancient story says humans were deliberately fashioned. Modern science says life can be altered through code and inheritance. Put the two together and you get a powerful myth for the technology age mankind, not as naturally emergent, but as designed labour. It is dramatic. It is eerie. It also requires a great deal of interpretive stretching. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the ancient evidence does not directly support modern genetic language. The evidence we do have points to myths in which gods create humans through sacred materials and divine action, often to serve a role in the cosmos. A more cautious explanation could be that modern audiences map the idea of creation onto the nearest thing their own era finds plausible or frightening. In one age, creation by gods feels normal. In another, creation by engineering feels plausible. The human fear underneath both may be the same. Were you chosen or assembled? You walk through a workshop quarter where people are making things the old way, with hands, heat timing, and repeated correction. Potters turn wheels. Weavers tighten threads. Metalworkers manage fire with absolute concentration, because ancient industrial safety policies are, shall we say, spiritually aspirational. Everywhere the city reminds you that to make is to mix, measure, and refine. Most historians agree that craft metaphors often shape ancient thinking. One interpretation is that creation myths naturally borrow the logic of workshops, because workshops are where transformation becomes visible. That matters because when a Mesopotamian story speaks of gods using clay and divine essence, it may be functioning as a sacred craft image, not a coded biotechnology manual. Historians still argue whether particular creation details should be read primarily as ritual symbolism, social allegory, or mythic cosmology. But mainstream scholarship does not treat these texts as veiled genetic science. The Anunnaki engineered humans theory belongs to a much later mode of reading, one shaped by modern science fiction, popular mystery literature, and the irresistible charm of explaining everything with one secret mechanism. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Ancient texts do sometimes speak of gods mixing substances using divine blood, or fashioning people with intention. That much is real. What cannot be confirmed is the leap from mythic mixture to molecular intervention. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here it is thin indeed when it comes to literal genetics. Still, the theory holds on because it speaks to something emotionally ancient. You feel it as you pass a woman kneading dough in a courtyard, while a child beside her shapes little figures from mud. To shape life, or even to imagine shaping life, produces an odd mixture of comfort and unease. A popular rumour claims that creator myths across cultures are garbled memories of biological engineering by superior beings. This theory is not widely accepted, but it survives because creation stories keep landing near the same questions. Why are humans so clever and so fragile at once? Why do we build cities and still break so easily? Why does consciousness feel like a gift and an inconvenience in roughly equal measure? Honestly, if someone engineered humanity, they were either a genius or very committed to side quests. You move past a shrine where an offering has just been placed before a divine statue. The gesture is simple, practiced, and full of meaning. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion is not interested in separating the sacred from the practical. Human life exists inside obligation. The gods create order and receive service. One interpretation is that the later genetic creation reading catches on because it makes this ancient structure sound chillingly modern. Instead of gods and servants, you get makers and designed workers. Instead of ritual dependency, you get programmed function. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the real continuity is not technical at all. Maybe ancient creator stories and modern genetic fantasies both emerge from the same human discomfort with being made for purposes you did not choose. Ancient Mesopotamian myth says in one register that humans come into being under higher intention. Modern speculative theory says the same thing in a different accent. The costumes change. The anxiety stays. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian myths describe humanity as fashioned from earthly material and divine involvement. The interpretive part is that these stories may reflect labour systems, sacred craft imagery, and political hierarchy more than biological theory. The imaginative mist is the idea that perhaps the old stories preserve an encoded memory of deliberate intervention by beings remembered later as the Anunnaki. Scholars continue to debate why these modern readings become so culturally sticky. One interpretation is that they offer a myth for secular times. They let people keep the drama of creation while replacing miracle with mechanism. Another is that they satisfy a longing for hidden design in a world where human origins, as explained by science, can feel vast, impersonal, and emotionally unscripted. Most historians agree that human evolution unfolds over immense timescales through natural processes, not sudden tampering by ancient sky rulers. But evolution, for all its explanatory power, does not always scratch the same emotional itch as a story in which someone meant for you to be here. That is why the Anunnaki theory survives, not because the tablets demand it, but because the human imagination keeps requesting it. You stop at the edge of the canal again. The water glints under the sun. Workers move in the distance. Temple roofs shimmer slightly in the heat. Everything in this city is made maintained and vulnerable. Perhaps that is why the thought of makers remains so potent. To live in a world of constructed things is to suspect that you too may have been constructed. And as the day presses down on the ancient plane, the old myths and the modern word keep circling one another, not quite touching, but close enough to make sparks. The Anunnaki do not become genetic engineers in the ancient evidence, but in the modern mind, under the pressure of science, mystery, and old existential unease, they begin to wear that mask with unsettling ease. That unsettling ease tells you something important, and not only about the Anunnaki. It tells you how human beings respond when confronted with sudden greatness, whether that greatness belongs to a city, a monument, a system of writing, or a sky full of patterns too regular to feel accidental. When the ordinary explanation feels almost too ordinary for the scale of what was achieved, another kind of explanation begins to slip in. Not always because the evidence demands it, but because awe itself starts looking for a face. And that brings you to one of the most persistent questions in this whole journey. If Mesopotamian civilization was so early, so organised, so symbolically rich, why do so many people feel tempted to imagine outside help? Most historians agree that the rise of civilization in southern Mesopotamia can be explained through human adaptation, irrigation, agriculture, trade, administrative innovation, religious institutions, and the gradual concentration of population into urban centres. What's broadly accepted is that these developments do not appear all at once and do not require non-human intervention. Archaeology suggests long processes, not magical leaps. Villages grow, surpluses accumulate, hierarchies harden, temples expand, writing emerges from accounting needs and later expands into literature. It is slow, layered, and deeply human. And yet when you stand before the scale of it, human sometimes feels too small a word. You walk now through the market district as carts creak over packed earth, and traders call out over baskets of dates, barley oil, cloth fish, and whatever else a city needs in order to keep pretending it has everything under control. The place is loud, practical, and alive. No one here looks like a mysterious visiting architect from the stars. They look tired, clever, competitive, devout, hungry, suspicious, and occasionally delighted, which is to say they look exactly like people responsible for building history. One interpretation is that the very brilliance of early civilization causes later observers to underestimate ordinary human capability. A careful reading might suggest that outsider theories sometimes begin where admiration becomes disbelief. Historians still argue whether we moderns underestimate the cumulative power of many small changes over long stretches of time, especially when those changes become visible only after centuries. That is a crucial point. Ancient cities can feel sudden because archaeology often shows you them in mature form, already impressive, already layered, already busy with institutions and sacred meanings. But the evidence we do have points to long development. Irrigation systems are refined, labour is organised more tightly, storage and redistribution become more complex, ritual centres expand, regional competition intensifies. None of this is glamorous in isolation. Together it produces Uruk. A fringe idea proposes that sudden leaps in civilization, whether in Mesopotamia or elsewhere, indicate direct teaching from superior beings, often linked in modern retellings to the Anunnaki. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it spreads because the phrase sudden leap is emotionally persuasive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it sounds tidy. Humans living simply, advanced beings arrive, knowledge appears, civilization blooms, cue dramatic music, and someone staring at a star map with profound concern. But a more cautious explanation could be that what feels sudden in myth or popular retelling is often gradual in material history. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot reconstruct every step of innovation, every local experiment, every failed settlement, every clever manager, every canal repair, every argument over grain and labour that slowly built the world of the first cities. But not being able to watch every brick laid does not mean someone non-human laid them. You move from the market toward a workshop where beads are being drilled and polished. Nearby, a seal cutter leans over the stone with astonishing patience. Tiny images emerge under practiced hands. Most historians agree that specialised labourcraft, expertise and administrative tools were central to early urban society. Cylinder seals, ration systems, storage accounting and institutional control all point to intensifying complexity. What's broadly accepted is that civilization looks dramatic at the top because thousands of repetitive acts support it from below. That may be the least mysterious and most humbling answer of all. Still, the outsider theory persists because it flatters modern imagination in two directions at once. It makes the ancient special touched by powers beyond the ordinary, and it gives modern people a thrilling secret to uncover. A popular rumour claims that ordinary humans could not have developed agriculture, administration, monumental architecture, and symbolic systems without guidance from higher intelligences. This theory is not widely accepted, and it often says more about modern impatience than about ancient capability. We are used to compressed timelines, instant tools, and explanations that come in neat packages. Ancient development asks for a slower kind of respect. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that early Mesopotamian civilization grows through human institutions, labour, and environmental management. The interpretive part is that its scale and sophistication may have inspired both ancient and modern feelings of contact with something beyond the ordinary. The imaginative mist is the thought that perhaps the Anunnaki, or beings remembered through them, once served as teachers, whose influence later got folded into divine myth. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. And here, once again, the evidence for literal outsider instruction is thin, but the evidence for astonishment is abundant. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the real secret is not that someone came from the sky to teach humans how to live in cities, but that city life itself feels so unnatural at first that it might as well have descended from heaven. Think about it. You spend thousands of years in smaller communities, closer to seasonal rhythms, and then gradually you create a place where strangers live. Shoulder to shoulder, grain is counted in central stores. Priests align time with ritual. Rulers claim heavenly sanctioned scribes trap speech in clay, and labour becomes an organised river of obligation. Of course it feels imposed. Of course it feels revealed. Of course later memory wraps it in the language of gods. You pause near a half-built wall where labourers are handing mud bricks from one to another in steady rhythm. Pass, place a line. Pass, place a line. It is almost hypnotic. Archaeology suggests that urbanism in Mesopotamia emerges not just from ideas, but from coordination. Someone has to measure, supervise record, and redistribute. Someone has to decide where the wall goes. Someone has to feed the workers. Someone has to bless the undertaking so it feels more like destiny than exhaustion. And that perhaps is where divine teachers enter the imagination. Not because hidden beings taught mathematics, but because large systems of order are easiest to accept when they come wrapped in sacred legitimacy. Scholars continue to debate the degree to which religion drove early state formation versus reflected it, because in ancient Mesopotamia, those forces are profoundly entangled. Temples are economic centres. Kingship is cosmological. Ritual structures time. One interpretation is that civilization and divinity grow together in the record because each strengthens the other. The city needs sacred meaning. The gods need houses, offerings, and administrators. Everyone gets a job, including you naturally. You smile a little at the thought, because the whole world here feels like it was assembled by committees with access to incense. But beneath the gentle humour, the point remains sharp. The Anunnaki do not need to be literal civilizing aliens for the myths around them to preserve a real historical sensation, the feeling that human life changed so dramatically in the first cities that it seemed guided from above. That sensation matters. It may not prove anything extraordinary. It may not confirm forgotten creators walking the reed marshes. Yet it does tell you why the theory survives. Human brilliance, when viewed from far enough away, starts to look almost foreign. And as evening begins to soften the edges of the city once more, you carry that thought with you. Not as conclusion, but as clue. Civilization may have been built by human hands, yes. Most historians agree that it was. But those same hands built something so large, so structured, and so world-changing that later ages could hardly believe the builders were only human. Somewhere in that disbelief, the Anunnaki wait, ready to be imagined not just as gods of old Mesopotamian religion, but as the lost tutors of mankind, called into being by the ancient habit of looking at greatness and wondering who taught us how to do that. The wondering does not end in the ancient city. In some ways, it grows stronger the farther you move from it. The mud brick walls fall. The temple roofs collapse. The reed boats rot away. The canal beds shift. Empires come and go. Languages die, then return as puzzles. And somewhere thousands of years later, in museums, lecture halls, paperbacks, documentaries, and midnight internet rabbit holes, the old Mesopotamian names rise again into modern light. Anu, Enki, Enlil, Anunnaki. Suddenly the first cities are no longer just ancient. They are available. Translated, half-translated, debated, dramatized, and frequently given far better marketing than the scribes ever planned. Most historians agree that the rediscovery and decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th and early 20th centuries transformed modern understanding of Mesopotamia. What's broadly accepted is that excavations at sites such as Nineveh, Uruk, and elsewhere brought vast numbers of tablets and inscriptions into scholarly view. Archaeology suggests that once these materials began to be read, the modern world realised with some surprise that the ancient Near East had preserved literature, myths, legal texts, omen series, royal inscriptions, and flood stories far older than many people had imagined. The evidence we do have points to a genuine intellectual shock. A lost world had started speaking again. And when lost worlds speak again, people rarely listen quietly. You can picture it. Crates of tablets arriving in Europe. Scholars bending over broken clay with magnifying lenses and dictionaries in progress. Public fascination spreading as old names and stranger stories surface. Flood narratives older than familiar ones. Kingship descending from heaven. Gods shaping human beings from earth. Cosmic struggles. Layered divine families. One interpretation is that the modern Anunnaki craze becomes possible not just because of what the tablets say, but because of how they re-entered modern culture in fragments, in headlines, in partial translations, in a world already hungry for ancient secrets. Historians still argue whether early popular presentations of Mesopotamian texts unintentionally encouraged oversimplified readings by making complex materials sound more unified or sensational than they really were. That would not be shocking. Humans have never met a difficult archive they could not immediately try to turn into a dramatic summary. As you move through this modern phase of the story, the setting changes. No longer temple courtyards and reed beds alone, but Victorian reading rooms, excavation trenches, museum display cases, and later the paperback shelves of the 20th century. What's broadly accepted is that modern scholarship on Mesopotamia advanced through painstaking philology, comparison, excavation, and revision. But alongside careful scholarship came popular retellings, speculative syntheses, and that wonderfully dangerous phrase, hidden history. A fringe idea proposes that modern translators stumbled onto ancient records of non-human creators and either misunderstood them or softened them into religion. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it thrives because translation itself feels mysterious to non-specialists. If an unreadable script suddenly becomes a story, then perhaps some assume the translator holds the keys to everything. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why people begin wondering whether something important got lost, edited, or politely ignored between the clay tablet and the printed page. But a more cautious explanation could be that translation is simply hard, especially when texts are damaged, terminology shifts across centuries, and mythic language refuses to behave like technical prose. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Early translations were sometimes imperfect because scholarship was developing. Later translations improve, differ, and refine. That does not mean a suppressed truth was buried in the footnotes. Often it means ancient literature is exactly what it looks like, from close range, rich, unstable, contextual, poetic, and often maddeningly resistant to single answer readings. Still, the modern imagination sees opportunity in resistance. You stand now in a museum gallery or imagine yourself there under soft lights. A clay tablet rests behind glass. It is smaller than expected. So much of ancient mystery is. The object itself looks humble, almost modest, yet it carries marks made before many of the world's later civilizations even existed. Most historians agree that the public encounter with such artifacts helped fuel a sense of deep antiquity that modern culture was not fully prepared for. The first cities were no longer biblical scenery or vague classical rumour. They were real, complicated, and old enough to rearrange cultural imagination. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe modern Anunnaki theories spread not because the evidence is overwhelming, but because rediscovered Mesopotamia arrived at exactly the right psychological moment. Science had grown powerful, traditional certainties were being questioned, evolution had changed the conversation about origins, industry had transformed daily life, empire and archaeology were feeding public fascination with lost civilizations. Into that moment came clay tablets saying that ancient gods made humans assigned labour governed from heaven and survived in stories older than expected. Of course, people started connecting dots no ancient scribe had ever drawn. A popular rumour claims that scholars know far more about literal Anunnaki creator beings than they admit publicly. This theory is not widely accepted, and the evidence for it is thin. What's broadly accepted is that scholars disagree with one another. Plenty publish competing interpretations, revise older readings, and argue vigorously because the material is difficult, not because they are secretly united in protecting a cosmic family secret. Honestly, academics already have enough trouble agreeing on lunch. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that cuneiform decipherment and archaeology reopen the world of Mesopotamian myth to modern readers. The interpretive part is that fragmentary publication, public fascination, and partial understanding help transform the Anunnaki from ancient divine figures into modern mystery icons. The imaginative mist is the thought that perhaps the tablets returned when humanity was ready to hear them differently. Not more accurately, perhaps, but more anxiously. That anxiety matters. Modern people do not read ancient creators the way ancient people did. You live in an age that worries about engineering surveillance, code-lost knowledge, elite control, and whether human identity is more designed than free. So when you meet a Mesopotamian story about divine beings shaping mankind, you do not only hear religion, you hear programming, you hear manufacture, you hear ownership. One interpretation is that the modern Anunnaki phenomenon says as much about contemporary fears as it does about ancient beliefs. Archaeology suggests artifacts survive silently. It is readers who make them loud. The tablet behind the glass does not insist that the Anunnaki engineered your species. It does not deny it either, because clay is famously unhelpful in live debates. It simply holds its marks and waits for minds to meet them. Scholars continue to debate how modern myth-making around Mesopotamia should be understood, whether as harmless imaginative extension, pseudo-historical error, spiritual reinterpretation, or some messy combination of all three. And as you leave the gallery and step back into the hum of the modern world, the old names come with you. Not because they have been finally solved, but because they have been reborn in new context. The Anunnaki no longer live only in temple hymns or damaged epics. They live in documentaries, novels, message boards, speculation channels, and the late-night question that keeps returning whenever human beings confront origins too large, too old, and too incomplete to settle comfortably. Perhaps the rediscovered tablets did not reveal forgotten creators in any straightforward sense, but they did something almost as powerful. They gave the modern imagination ancient clay broken lines, and just enough mystery to begin building new myths of its own. Those new myths cling to you as you leave the museum in your mind, and return once more to the older ground beneath them. Because for all the modern fascination, the deepest question has not changed. If ancient Mesopotamian stories speak of divine beings making humanity, how do those stories sit beside the much larger and much slower scientific account of human origins? How do fossils, genes and deep evolutionary time live in the same room as clay gods and sacred intention without throwing pottery at one another? Most historians agree that the human story as understood through modern science unfolds over immense stretches of time. What's broadly accepted is that Homo sapiens emerged through evolutionary processes long before the rise of Sumerian cities, cuneiform writing, or Mesopotamian temple religion. Archaeology suggests that by the time the first cities appeared in southern Mesopotamia, humans had already been speaking, making tools burying their dead, creating symbolic art, and adapting to wildly different environments for many thousands of years. The evidence we do have points to a species with a very long prehistory, not a sudden appearance in the age of ziggurats. That is the solid ground again. And yet one interpretation is that mythic creator stories address a different layer of human anxiety than science does. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian creation tales are not asking how bones changed shape over millennia, or how populations branched and mixed. They are asking why human life feels obligated, fragile, and strangely purposeful. Why work exists. Why hierarchy exists. Why suffering fits so neatly into the machinery of order. Historians still argue whether ancient creation myths should be read primarily as theological explanation, political reflection, ritual drama, or social memory. But very few would say they function as scientific origin accounts in the modern sense. That distinction matters, although it does not always satisfy the part of you that wants one answer to rule them all. You walk now through open land outside the city, where the river plain stretches broad and sunlit, and the horizon feels old enough to swallow centuries without effort. Imagine the deep past layered beneath your feet, long before temple courts and king lists, hunter-gatherers, early farmers, slow shifts in climate and settlement, countless generations leaving almost nothing the eye can see. Most historians agree that by the time Mesopotamian myths about creation were written down, they were already being told by a species whose true origin lay vastly earlier. In that sense, the Anunnaki stories do not mark the beginning of humanity. They mark one civilization's attempt to narrate humanity's place in the cosmos. A fringe idea proposes that science traces the body, while myth preserves the intervention, meaning that evolution may have produced early humans. But some later event, often linked in modern theories to the Anunnaki, transformed them into fully human beings through outside influence. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is one of the more adaptable modern compromise models. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it offers something many people find emotionally appealing, a way to keep deep time, while also keeping intentional design. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And the ancient Mesopotamian sources do not explicitly describe such a hybrid model in modern terms. The evidence we do have points to mythic creation language, and scientific evidence points to long biological development. A more cautious explanation could be that people often want myth and science to answer the same question, when in practice they often answer different ones. Science asks how bodies and populations change. Myth asks what it feels like to be the sort of creature who must work, worship, obey, love, grieve, and die. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You can trace genetic inheritance across vast timescales with modern tools. You can excavate settlements and compare skeletons. You can build a persuasive picture of human evolution. What you cannot do, at least not with the same method, is excavate purpose. You cannot carbon date obligation. You cannot sequence the gene for feeling oddly misplaced under the stars. And that gap is where creator myths breathe. You stop beneath a tamarisk tree at the edge of irrigated ground, while the wind moves softly through the reeds. Far off the city rises in shimmering lines. Somewhere between you and it, workers are still bent over fields, because ancient existence never fully takes a lunch break. One interpretation is that the power of the Anunnaki creator theory comes from this emotional gap between explanation and meaning. Evolution tells you how humans came to be in one sense. Mesopotamian myth tells you how being human feels in another. Modern speculative theory then tries to fuse those layers into one grand narrative, as though a scientific process and a sacred complaint about labour could secretly be the same story seen from opposite sides. A popular rumour claims that mainstream science dismisses ancient myths because it fears what they imply about human origins. This theory is not widely accepted, and it misstates the issue. What's broadly accepted is that science and ancient myth operate by different standards of evidence and intention. Scientific models change when new data appears. Ancient myths endure because they hold symbolic and cultural power, not because they offer testable biological mechanisms. Scholars continue to debate how myth and science should be related in public understanding, but debate is not the same as suppression. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that humanity long predates Sumer, and that evolution provides the mainstream explanation for biological origins. The interpretive part is that Mesopotamian creator stories may speak to social and existential realities rather than anatomy. The imaginative mist is the thought that maybe somewhere between deep time and written myth, there was an intervention no tablet describes clearly, and no fossil can neatly isolate. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the old clay stories survive because they say something evolution does not try to say. They tell you that being human feels like being shaped. Not just born, but formed under pressures you did not choose. Formed by nature, yes, but also by society, duty, memory, and fear. Mesopotamian religion puts gods at the beginning of that feeling. Modern science puts natural history there. Modern Anunnaki theory tries to join the two by imagining a missing act of deliberate making. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it reveals a real hunger. People want origins to mean something personal. You crouch and let a handful of dirt run through your fingers. Dry on top, darker beneath. Soil time layers. Archaeology suggests that every civilization builds its meaning on ground far older than itself. Mesopotamia did not invent humanity. It inherited humanity and then wrapped that inheritance in stories grand enough to make it bearable. Most historians agree that ancient myths are mirrors as much as memories. They reflect what a people fears, values, organises, and cannot quite explain any other way. And perhaps that is why the Anunnaki remain compelling even when the scientific case for literal genetic creation is weak. They occupy a space between explanation and intention, between the fossil and the prayer, between the body that evolved and the mind that still wonders whether someone somewhere meant for it to wake up and ask questions. The sun leans westward now over the river plain, and the city glows softly in the distance. You are not choosing between science and story tonight. You are watching them circle the same old wound from different directions, each trying in its own language to answer why a creature made of dust and memory would feel so intensely as though it had been fashioned on purpose. That feeling of being fashioned on purpose does not fade as the light lowers. If anything, it grows stronger in the evening, when the city softens and the mind begins doing what minds have always done at the edge of sleep. Gathering pieces, comparing shadows, wondering whether the story behind the story is simpler than you hoped or stranger than you feared. By now, you have walked through clay creation, divine labour, heavenly hierarchy, flood memory, sacred astronomy, and the modern hunger to turn myth into biology. And here, at this stage, the question becomes more delicate. Not what one tablet says, but whether there was ever one single doctrine hiding underneath all the versions at all. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian religion changed across long spans of time, and across different cities, languages, and political worlds. What's broadly accepted is that Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian traditions overlap, influence one another, and sometimes preserve older material while giving it new emphasis. Archaeology suggests continuity in some divine names and themes, but not a frozen system unchanged from one age to the next. The evidence we do have points to adaptation, layering, and reinterpretation, rather than one perfectly stable religious code. That is important because modern mystery readings often prefer a single clean key. One interpretation is that people want the Anunnaki to be one thing, one race, one program, one hidden answer, because one answer feels restful. A careful reading might suggest the ancient material is much less tidy. The Anunnaki may be significant, yes, but significance is not the same as consistency. Historians still argue whether the word carried the same theological force in every period, or whether later readers, ancient and modern alike, keep smoothing over differences that mattered a great deal in context. You walk at dusk through a city lane where plastered walls hold the last warmth of the sun. A woman is folding cloth in a doorway. Somewhere bread is cooling. Somewhere else someone is having exactly the kind of argument about grain storage that proves civilization is mostly a series of people trying to sound authoritative while slightly sweaty. The world is ordinary again, and that helps, because what's broadly accepted is that ancient religion lived inside ordinary places. It was not designed as one giant encrypted file waiting for modern code breakers. It was practiced, revised, sung, copied, argued over, and bent to new political realities. So what does that mean for the Anunnaki? A fringe idea proposes that beneath all the local variations there lies a hidden original truth, a pristine ancient memory of creator beings who engineered humanity and whose story later fractured into religion. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it is deeply attractive. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it gives every contradiction a purpose. Variations become distortions, missing lines become concealment, theological evolution becomes corruption of the original message. Suddenly, the messiness of the record looks deliberate, and mystery gains the upper hand. But let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the evidence does not require a lost master doctrine behind every surviving version. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient religions are usually plural, local and dynamic. Gods shift in rank, myths travel, priests adapt, kings sponsor new emphases, cities elevate their own divine patrons. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot reconstruct one universal Mesopotamian religion, because no such single unchanging thing may ever have existed. That may sound less thrilling than a hidden archive of original Anunnaki science, but in its own way it is more interesting. It means the ancient world was alive. You pass a small shrine tucked into a neighbourhood space rather than a grand, formal precinct. A lamp flickers inside. A figure leaves an offering, quick and practiced. Most historians agree that religion in Mesopotamia worked at multiple levels, from royal ideology and temple administration to household devotion and local custom. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki, because they belong to the higher and more formal layers of divine order in many modern discussions, get pulled away from the lived diversity of ancient religion. They become cleaner in theory than they ever were in practice. A popular rumour claims that if only we could recover the oldest layer of myth without later priestly edits, the Anunnaki would finally reveal themselves as literal makers of humanity. This theory is not widely accepted, and it rests on a modern assumption that the oldest version is always the truest. Archaeology suggests something different. Older does not always mean clearer. Earlier traditions can be just as symbolic, local and context-bound as later ones. Sometimes they are even murkier, which is very rude of them, but historically common. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian religion shifts across time and place, leaving a layered rather than uniform record. The interpretive part is that the Anunnaki may never have belonged to one single universal doctrine in the way modern theories often assume. The imaginative mist is the thought that perhaps all these overlapping traditions are fractured windows looking back toward one more ancient source that no surviving tablet preserves cleanly. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the real lesson of the Anunnaki is not hidden certainty but durable ambiguity. Maybe they endure precisely because they cannot be flattened into one simple role: creator, judge, divine court, ancestral power, heavenly assembly, underworld authority, memory of order, symbol of distance. The word holds because it remains slightly open, and open things invite return. Scholars continue to debate how much coherence we should expect from long-lived religious traditions, especially when the evidence comes from different genres and centuries. Hymns do not speak exactly like myths. Ritual texts do not sound like king lists. Theological ideas in one city do not always line up neatly with another. Most historians agree that context matters. That may be the least glamorous sentence in all of history, but it rescues you from many bad conclusions. You leave the lane and move toward higher ground where the temple rises against a violet sky. Birds cross overhead on their way to roost. The city quiets in waves rather than all at once. A pot clinks, sandals scrape, voices fade. In that in-between light, the Anunnaki feel almost close enough to define and then not. That is their old trick. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, perhaps later creator theories are trying to solve emotionally what the ancient record leaves unsolved intellectually. Human beings dislike a chorus of half-matching voices. We want the one original version, the one clean origin, the single hidden answer that makes all the fragments snap together. But ancient Mesopotamia may be offering the opposite. Not one coded doctrine, but a layered memory palace where divine names move through centuries, collecting new meanings as they go. And that layered quality may itself be the clue. Civilization did not rise in one moment, and neither did its myths. The first stories were never motionless. They were carried by mouths, hands, schools, temples, kings, and crises. They bent because life bent. They survived because they adapted. So when modern readers ask for the one true Anunnaki explanation, the old record answers with something gentler and far more difficult. There's no full consensus. There may never have been. By the time darkness settles fully over the city, you understand that the puzzle is not failing to become simple. The puzzle is telling you that simplicity was never the point. The Anunnaki remain compelling because they stand at the meeting place of history, theology and longing never fully pinned down, always seeming to promise that one more tablet, one more translation, one more careful reading might bring the whole design into view. And perhaps that hope, more than any lost laboratory or hidden code, is what keeps their old names alive. That hope stays with you as night settles completely, because once you accept that the ancient record may never collapse into one tidy answer, another question quietly takes its place. If there is no single hidden doctrine waiting to be uncovered, then where exactly does the mystery live? Is it in the missing tablets, the shifting roles, the later rumours, the modern projections? Or is it something simpler and stranger than all of that, something built into the very nature of ancient religion itself? By now the city is darker, calmer and softer at the edges. The temple lamps glow in still pockets. The river moves almost invisibly. Somewhere a reed door creaks. Somewhere a night watchman clears his throat with the solemnity of a man who would very much like you to know he is technically awake. And in that softened darkness, the whole world of Mesopotamia feels less like a solved puzzle and more like a chorus. Not one voice, but many. Not one doctrine, but overlapping traditions, repeated formulas, old names with changing emphasis, local devotions brushing against imperial theology. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian religion was never perfectly uniform. Archaeology suggests substantial continuity across centuries, yes, but also regional variation, political adaptation, and theological drift. Gods rise in prominence, absorb traits, trade associations, or move in and out of centrality, depending on city dynasty, language, and ritual setting. Most historians agree that when modern people search for the Mesopotamian belief about something, they are often asking the ancient world to behave with a neatness it never promised. And that is especially true of the Anunnaki. One interpretation is that the modern obsession with pinning down exactly who or what the Anunnaki really were tells you more about modern habits of thought than about ancient certainty. You want categories, creator race, divine judges, sky rulers, underworld powers, ancestors, cosmic engineers. But a careful reading might suggest that the old traditions are not built to satisfy this kind of demand. They are built to function in ritual poetry, authority, memory, and symbolic order. Historians still argue whether later readers exaggerate the coherence of the term simply because the alternative, a set of partially overlapping meanings across time, feels too untidy to be emotionally satisfying. Untidy, sadly, is one of history's favourite textures. You walk through a quiet temple passage where the plaster catches lamplight in pale streaks. On one wall, repairs from different periods show through like faint scars. That layered wall becomes a good image for the whole problem. Mesopotamian religion is not one smooth original surface. It is layers. A god honoured in one age gets reinterpreted in another. A title, once clear, becomes broader, darker, or more ceremonial. A collective, like the Anunnaki, may carry different associations depending on whether you meet them in myth ritual, royal ideology, or later theological material. The evidence we do have points to exactly that kind of complexity. In some contexts, the Anunnaki seem close to the high divine order. In others, they appear more strongly associated with judgment or the underworld. In later modern retellings, they become creator beings with technological motives. A fringe idea proposes that all these shifting appearances are distorted remnants of one original truth preserved imperfectly across millennia. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains seductive because it turns confusion into evidence. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then every contradiction suddenly feels intentional, as though the ancient world were winking at you through the cracks. But a more cautious explanation could be that contradictions are normal in long-lived religions. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And what we cannot confirm here is the existence of one single stable, universally understood Anunnaki doctrine sitting behind every text. What's broadly accepted is that the ancient material reflects diversity rather than unanimity. That may seem less exciting at first glance, but in truth it makes the whole picture more alive, more human, and more historically plausible. You pass out into an open court where the stars are visible again between the temple roofs. A lamp flickers near a shrine. A cat slips past you like it personally owns the moonlight, which, to be fair, is exactly how cats have behaved in every civilization worthy of the name. The city is quieter now, and that quiet lets a different thought come forward. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the reason the Anunnaki never settle into one neat explanation is that they were never meant to. Maybe they belong to a sacred imagination that works through accumulation rather than precision. A divine name gathers meaning over time. A ritual repeats it. A hymn reshapes it. A king borrows it. A priest explains it differently to fit a new moment. A scribe copies one line faithfully and alters another slightly without malice, simply because memory and tradition are living things. The result is not failure. The result is religious life. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian religion changes across cities and centuries, leaving no single frozen doctrine of the Anunnaki behind. The interpretive part is that modern attempts to force coherence onto the term may flatten precisely the diversity that made it durable. The imaginative mist is the thought that perhaps the old multiplicity itself is the surviving trace of something once felt as overwhelming, too large for one definition, too immense to stay fixed in a single image. A popular rumour claims that if only the right combination of tablets were found, the Anunnaki mystery would resolve into a final answer, complete and undeniable. This theory is not widely accepted, and it assumes history behaves like a locked room novel, waiting for one brilliant detective to rearrange the clues. Archaeology suggests something slower and less theatrical. New finds may sharpen, refine, complicate, or challenge. But ancient religions do not usually surrender a single final essence, because they were not built from a single essence in the first place. Scholars continue to debate how much modern categories distort ancient materials. Was a given text theological, literary, political, ritual, local, or all of the above at once? Were divine collectives understood literally, symbolically, ceremonially, or situationally, depending on audience and genre? There's no full consensus, and that is not scholarly weakness. It is often the right response to evidence that refuses simplification. You sit for a while on a low wall overlooking a lane that leads toward the river. The smell of water and cooling brick drifts up in the night air. Somewhere farther off, someone laughs low and tired. Somewhere else, someone mutters at a donkey in a tone that suggests a very old and very one-sided feud. It is also ordinary, and that ordinariness helps you see the deeper point. The people who lived with these stories were not curating a mystery franchise. They were trying to live, to grow food, to survive floods, to justify kingship, to honour gods, to explain labour order, death and the sky. Most historians agree that myth in ancient societies is not just entertainment or speculation, it is infrastructure for meaning. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki endure because they sit inside several of the biggest ancient concerns, at once divine authority, cosmic order, ancestral depth, human service, and the haunting question of who, if anyone, governs from beyond sight. You do not need a hidden laboratory for that to be powerful. You need only a civilization old enough to feel that the world above and the world below belong to the same chain of command. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so, and the evidence remains thin for literal biological engineering, direct extraterrestrial contact, or a single secret doctrine hiding under every version of the Anunnaki. But the evidence is not thin for wonder. It is not thin for theological complexity. It is not thin for the ancient habit of using divine language to make the world feel ordered even when it was frighteningly unstable. And perhaps that is the real mystery in what remains. Not a hidden certainty, not a code waiting to unlock one perfect answer, but a surviving chorus of old voices that refuse to become one voice, and in refusing keep calling you back. As the night deepens over Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki begin to seem less like a missing fact, and more like a reminder. The first civilizations were not simple. Their religions were not simple. Their stories did not come to you clean. They came chipped, layered, repeated, adapted, and luminous at the edges. And maybe that is why the puzzle still glows. Not because it conceals one secret, but because it preserves the shape of humanity's oldest effort to speak about power beyond itself, without ever fully mastering the language. By now, the city has become almost entirely sound and outline. The lamps burn lower. The canals move like dark silk between banks of shadow. Temple walls hold the last memory of heat. Above them, the stars remain patient, remote, and a little too calm for creatures who spend so much time wondering whether someone put us here on purpose. You have followed the Anunnaki through clay kingship labour, astronomy broken tablets, modern theories, and the uneasy border between science and myth. And at the end of that long walk, what remains is not a final verdict, but a quieter understanding of why these old names still matter. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian people used myth to explain some of the largest pressures in human life work: hierarchy, suffering order, divine distance, and the stubborn fact that civilization feels both handmade and imposed. What's broadly accepted is that the Anunnaki belong first to this world of religion and sacred imagination, not to a confirmed record of biological engineering. Archaeology suggests changing roles, layered traditions, and divine hierarchies shaped by time and place. The evidence we do have points to a human civilization trying to make sense of itself in the oldest cities on Earth. And yet one interpretation is that later creator theories endure because they dramatize those ancient questions so vividly. If humans were fashioned, then by whom? If labour was assigned, then why? If kingship descended from heaven, then what exactly stood between the heavens and the mud below? Historians still argue whether modern readings of the Anunnaki reveal more about Mesopotamia or more about us. A careful reading might suggest the answer is both. Ancient myth gives you the frame. Modern anxiety fills it with different light. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal creators who genetically shaped humanity for service, and that the old myths preserve this as symbolic memory. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it continues to circulate because it speaks in the language of our age. Design, intervention, hidden knowledge, lost control. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, then the old stories start to feel uncannily current. But a more cautious explanation could be that every age remakes ancient gods in its own image. The industrial age liked systems. The space age liked visitors. The genetic age likes makers. What if the story is pointing at something else? Maybe the deepest pull of the Anunnaki is not that they might explain human origins in a scientific sense, but that they embody a more emotional truth. To be human often feels like being shaped by forces you did not choose. Biology shapes you. Society shapes you. Work shapes you. Family law, hunger, memory, grief, hope and time all leave their marks. Mesopotamian myth gathers that feeling and places divine names at the top of it. Modern Anunnaki theory gathers the same feeling and translates it into the language of engineering. The costume changes, the ache remains. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian texts preserve a rich and changing world of God's creators, labour, and sacred order. The interpretive part is that these stories may reflect the realities of early urban life, more than literal accounts of human manufacture. The imaginative mist is the thought that perhaps ancient memory sometimes preserves a feeling so powerful it gets mistaken for evidence. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You sit now at the edge of the river and let the night settle properly around you. A reed rustles. Water touches mud with the softest sound. Far off a dog barks once and then thinks better of continuing. The city behind you is still there, but gentler now, reduced to scattered lights and sleeping roofs. It is easier here to believe that the first stories were never about proof in the first place. They were about position, about where a person stands beneath the sky, beneath power, beneath time. Scholars continue to debate the boundaries between religion, politics, social memory, and literary imagination in the ancient Near East, and there's no full consensus on every detail of the Anunnaki. But perhaps that lack of final closure is not a flaw. Perhaps it is the correct ending for a subject that has always lived halfway between earth and heaven. Most historians agree that Sumer and its successors built the first great cities through human labour, adaptation and institution. That is the solid ground. Yet the mist remains around the edges because old myths keep doing what old myths do. They turn practical life into cosmic drama. They make obligation feel ancient. They give names to the powers above the ladder of ordinary people. And so as the last part of the night deepens, you let the whole question soften. Not solved, not dismissed, simply placed where it belongs. The Anunnaki may not have been mankind's forgotten genetic creators in any way history can firmly support. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and the evidence remains too thin to stand on confidently. But they do survive as something perhaps just as revealing a mirror of humanity's oldest suspicion that life was shaped by hands beyond its own, and that the first cities remembered that suspicion in stories grand enough to outlive their walls. Now the pace slows even more. The river darkens into one long ribbon of quiet. The stars above Mesopotamia seem less like watchers and more like distant pinpricks in a fabric too large to measure. The city, with all its labour and incense and ledgers and tired shoulders, begins to feel far away, almost tender in memory. You do not need a final answer tonight. You do not need the tablets to confess one hidden truth, or the heavens to lean down and explain themselves. It is enough to know that ancient people, like people, now looked at the weight of life, and asked who, if anyone, had shaped it so. It is enough to know that they answered with clay gods, rivers, and names that still shimmer faintly in the dark. Let the questions loosen now. Let the old kings fade back into dust, the temple lamps into embers, the reed beds into shadow. Let the Anunnaki return to their proper distance, not gone, not proven, just resting in that old borderland between history and wonder. And as the water keeps moving past the sleeping city, slow and steady, and unbothered by theories of any kind, you can let your own thoughts drift with it, away from argument, away from certainty, and into the softer mystery of being here at all, beneath such a large and ancient sky.